Greetings to my colleagues, and I'm certainly enjoying learning from each of you. And I'm going to speak just briefly on Elmer's chapter 12 on the servant and power. And I've kind of divided what I've learned, some of the highlights, into three different headings. And I'll just refer to some things that I read that impacted me, make a few comments. First heading that I would use is called the purpose of power for a servant leader. And it's recognizing from the words of Elmer that power is to be used in the service of others and only secondarily, if at all, for the benefit of oneself. And I think when we really look at godly power from that perspective, it becomes obvious when we're not using power in a godly manner or for a godly purpose. And I think that for me, I remember becoming a pastor early on, and with that position, there was some power inherent in that role that it almost made you feel the pressure to use that power to exercise your own agenda, even if it was a noble agenda. And I think in reading about servant leadership and all the discussion we've had, I certainly can recognize that if we're not using our power to empower others, then really we are missing the purpose of using God's power as a servant leader. And certainly our goal should be to elevate the body of Christ, individual members in particular, so that they can be used of God in powerful ways. Beyond the purpose of power, I have another heading that I've just listed here as the protection of power. The protection of power. And I've come across this several times in our reading, and it really was a new concept for me. I don't know if that's something I should be embarrassed to admit, but that's just the way it is. But he makes the statement in chapter 12, like he has in other chapters: we must acknowledge that people bear the image of God, and we treat them in a way that will nurture the development of that image. And in so doing, we are honoring their creator. And I think that we can be servant leaders with power, but have a built-in protection if we truly acknowledge that every person we are influencing bears the image of God, and we owe it to God as we care for his children, to honor him by honoring them. If we can get that concept down, then I think that protects us in our interaction with people. He has an example of exploiting people, and we all do, unfortunately. But I think it's really hard to exploit people when you truly see them as the image of God. I love the quote from Abraham Lincoln: nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give him power. And I think that's certainly the case as a leader in any context, that when we start to focus on other people like they're just pawns, maybe it's a little bit more subtle than that, but we've got an agenda, we've got a plan, and our plan is more important than the people, then I think we really have missed it. So if we want to be servant leaders and exercise power in a way that we protect ourselves from ourselves, then I think we need to remember that people do bear the image of God. And certainly in that context, servant leadership always ends up being centered on others, serving them, building them up. And when we enter into other cultures, it can become pretty obvious pretty quickly to other people if that is truly our goal. And I think one of the things that has come through all of this that has stuck with me as well is that we must not present a God who is unconcerned about the whole person and thus distort the gospel. I think that's an important part in all of this. If we're so busy saving the world but we're not caring for people, then that kind of duplicity is going to really undermine the integrity of our witness and of our ministry. And certainly when we recognize that leadership and power begins with being a servant of God and serving others. And I think there's a protection in that when we live with that kind of goal. Finally, my third point is that there is a pathway to power, and kind of wish this would have been the first point, but in terms of reading the chapter, these particular aspects of what he shared came out at the end. And one point he made was that the gift of leadership is exercised with a profound humility that reveals a proper respect for God, for oneself, and for others. So I say the pathway to power, because if we truly will walk with humility, we'll be amazed at the power that God allows us to experience and exercise for the good of others and for his kingdom. And of course, as I have noted in reflecting on what Elmer has shared, the real mark of that humility is that we suspend our own agenda, our own vision, our own personal wishes, and listen to the wisdom of God through his people. No longer I serve as a pastor. It really does become less about my plans, less about my wisdom, and more about how God has placed people around me, that if I can empower them, then they can truly be used of God, and we can accomplish what God has for our church. And so I just made a note here at the end in trying to apply this specifically to my context, to beware of powerless leadership. And it's almost like a way that I can gauge my progress in these things. If people are only following me because of my position, then there's no power in that. And if people are only following me because of manipulation, I'm somehow able to convince them that this needs to be done, sometimes spiritualize it. Well, if you really are pleasing the Lord, you're going to please me. God forbid. And if you discover that people that are following me, if I discover that people that are following me are remaining powerless, and that's an amazing consideration, then really there's been no power in my leadership. So they follow me because of my position, no power. They follow me because I manipulated them, no power. They follow me and they remain powerless. Well, then there's been no real power in my ministry, my leadership. And so when the task is accomplished in our local church, may it be that the people can say, as Elmer said, we have done it. And I will say, the leader will say, by God's grace and for his glory. Finally, my question would be to Elmer, simply that these concepts seem so simple, so critical, so vital, but it does seem like many Christian leaders miss the basic core concepts of servant leadership. I feel like if I had not had it modeled to me and then followed up with classes like this, it's very easy to fall into a leadership that is certainly a carnal concept, the Gentile virus. And I think it's frightening that even good Christians, well-meaning Christians, can lead from that perspective. And I'd be curious as to why that would be the case, that we as Christians have been so maybe negligent of taking advantage of true servant leadership. Thanks for taking time to listen. Went a little bit long, but it is what it is. And God bless you all. Look forward to enjoying your presentations as well. And I appreciate Dr. Andrus for this opportunity.